Hello Flight Simmers and welcome to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. The purpose of this channel is to provide progressive flight simulator training aimed at honing pilot skills to maximize your enjoyment of Flight Simulator 2020. This video will be an overview of the channel, what we plan to accomplish with it, as well as a tutorial on setting up Flight Simulator 2020 for optimal training. Before we get started, a few disclaimers. First of all, this channel is for entertainment purposes and should not be construed as actual flight training. Second, this training will be oriented to how things work in Flight Simulator rather than real-world operations. We will talk about the difference between Flight Simulator and the real world a little bit, and talk about some of the options for making Flight Simulator as real or as entertaining as you want to. But for the most part, we're going to focus on how things operate in the simulator instead of how you would do it in the real world. Third, the training will be focused on pilot skills and aircraft systems operation rather than the technical aspects of Flight Simulator. We'll hit on some of the technical aspects of the simulator, particularly as they relate to setting up training flights, but we won't be doing in-depth training on setting up cameras or maximizing frame rates. It'll be mostly flying the airplane and how to operate the systems to get it to do what you want it to do in Flight Simulator. Finally, the training is going to start from a zero time or no previous experience level. This will be set up so that someone with no prior flight experience or Flight Simulator experience can start from the beginning and pick up the skills they need to enjoy Flight Simulator. My apologies to the advanced simmers out there, as the first few videos are going to be fairly rudimentary. I will be transitioning to more advanced skills in aircraft as we progress, though, so hang in there. In today's video, we'll take a look at setting up Flight Simulator for flight training. There's a number of options that we're going to want to turn on or off or set in a specific configuration to make for a good training environment. Then we're going to move on to basic VFR or visual flight rules, private pilot level training in a Cessna 152 trainer. This is going to include an aircraft familiarization, basic VFR maneuvers to get you comfortable with the 152 throughout its flight envelope, landings and traffic patterns, abnormal and emergency procedures in the 152, and finally navigation and cross-country flying. So let's take a look at setting up Flight Simulator for flight training. Alright, so we've booted up to the welcome screen of Flight Simulator. We're going to make the assumption that you've already installed Flight Simulator and that it's working for you. We're just going to talk about what we want to configure specifically for doing training flights. So we'll go on over to the options and into the general. There's not going to be a ton of stuff that are going to change here, but let's go ahead and take a look at it. For graphics, Flight Simulator setup does a pretty good job of assessing your system and setting up the graphic settings so that it will perform well on your system. Obviously, if you have higher end settings selected, your frame rates may take a hit depending on your hardware. Flight Simulator is pretty punishing on hardware, and it takes higher end hardware to get both good visuals and good frame rates. There are a number of things you can do if you're getting a sluggish experience or getting low frame rates. I generally recommend about at least 15, if not 20 frames per second to get a smooth enough experience to where the training is going to feel right for you. Obviously, there's some big settings that we can do to get the frame rates up. If you turn your global rendering quality down, that's going to do it, but you're also going to have a decreased visual experience. But there are a number of things in the menu that you can turn down that will increase your frame rates and not have a major impact on the visuals. I recommend looking at some of the videos out there that talk specifically about this, as I'm not an expert on this, but we'll talk about a few of them. Obviously, things like volumetric clouds, turning those down. A lot of the flights that we're going to be doing, at least initially, are going to be with clear skies and good visibility, so volumetric clouds aren't going to be a big thing. Turning down shadow maps or terrain shadows, windshield effects, light shafts, bloom, lens flare, all those sorts of things are going to increase your frame rates while not having a major impact on the visual. So those are things you can play around with. And again, there's a lot of good videos out there. One thing I do want to draw to your attention is the glass cockpit refresh rate. We'll talk about that more when we get into glass cockpits, which we won't be doing initially. But if you turn that down to like a medium setting, it'll reduce the refresh rate. So the glass cockpit may look a little bit choppier, but medium is not too bad. And it will definitely increase the frame rates when you're flying those types of aircraft. As far as the cameras go, this is kind of personal preference here. We will set up a couple of default views when we get to our cockpit familiarization that'll be good setups for seeing your instruments and seeing outside for doing maneuvers and landings and takeoffs and that sort of thing. There are a number of very good videos out there that go very in-depth into cameras and how to set up cameras for all the different things you can do. So I do recommend taking a look at that if that's something that you're interested in getting in depth with, as we're not going to go that in depth on this channel with it. As far as the sound settings go, I really haven't played around with the top selections too much, but I think the default should be fine. As far as the volume levels go, I do recommend leaving off aircraft engines, aircraft miscellaneous cockpits, and warnings, as well as environment. I recommend leaving those at 100%. That's because the aircraft sounds from the engine and just from the... For the traffic settings, I do recommend turning the AI traffic to off. This just eliminates things like having aircraft in the traffic pattern with you, or aircraft trying to take off or land directly in front of you, or while you're trying to land, they take the runway. Just eliminates those types of distractions so that you can focus on your aircraft control and your landing technique and not have those sorts of distractions to deal with while you're doing it. Everything else is personal preference. I did turn the airport vehicle density off and the worker density down to 0. But again, that's personal preference. We won't be doing a lot of ground training on this one. Just bear in mind that anything that you crank up that's going to be moving around in the world is going to cause a little bit of a drop in frame rates probably. So if you're having trouble with frame rates, this is another way to get those frame rates up, is to drop all the traffic off. With the data settings, that's very system dependent, and the setup does a pretty good job of setting that up. You probably have a pretty good awareness of what your data consumption needs to be or not be. So I just leave this at the defaults on this one. For the flight model, you do have two options, Modern and Legacy. The Legacy system is the flight modeler that was used in Flight Simulator 10. The Modern was built specifically for Flight Simulator 2020 and is supposedly a much more detailed physics modeler and aerodynamics modeler, and is much more realistic. So I do recommend sticking with that. If you do go with Legacy, you do have the option of doing more customizations as far as dialing down things like P-factor and torque, your left turning tendencies on takeoff. But the Modern aerodynamics are pretty good in this, and I do recommend sticking with that. Miscellaneous is mostly about language and selecting your pilot avatars, so that's all personal preference there. Accessibility is mostly about background colors and animations, text size, things like that, so whatever your preference is there. There's a developer mode you can turn on and off, and that gets you things like seeing your frame rates if you don't have a utility for doing that otherwise, but again, I don't recommend turning that on for training. Okay, so that's it for our general options. So we'll go back into the options menu and go into assistance, which is where we're going to make the bulk of our setup changes for setting up for our training environment. You can see that each of these tabs has a selector over here to where you can set it between easy, medium, and hard, or you can do a drop-down menu over here and you can set up each of these sub selections individually, and that's what we're going to be doing, and that will bring you to custom. So under piloting, I recommend that you go in and change each of these individual options to off, except for the takeoff auto rudder. I do recommend leaving that on, and the reason that I recommend that is because there are a number of left turning tendencies in a single engine airplane that cause the airplane to yaw left or have its nose veer to the left during takeoff. And Flight Simulator seems to overdo these forces, and so they're quite a bit stronger than they are in a real airplane, and leads to pilots over-controlling the rudders on takeoff, even experienced Flight Simulator pilots and real pilots. So I recommend leaving this on, and that leads to a smoother takeoff roll and less over-controlling. For the aircraft systems, none of these options are going to have a major effect on the training flights, but we'll go through them. With the auto mixture, that just leans out your mixture if you get up high so that you still maintain full power. For the training flights, this is not going to be a big deal. We're not going to be going up that high to conduct our maneuvers. But we'll probably turn that off when we get into cross-country, so we can talk about how to lean an engine with the mixture and get maximum power when you're at a higher altitude. Unlimited fuel, you should turn off. Yeah, you can turn that on and technically fly your 152 from LA to Tahiti if you really want to spend 20 hours in a 152. But really, to be realistic, let's turn that off and actually burn gas and have to do fuel calculations. Aircraft lights, I like playing with the switches, so I recommend leaving those on so you control the lights automatically. And the only thing I say leave unrealistic is the auto drift calibration. This will just keep your heading indicator from drifting off like it does in a real 152. It's just annoying and distracting, and you really don't learn anything by constantly having to change that. And all you do to correct it back to its normal heading is hit D, and it saves to the compass. So there's really no learning going on if you have that turned off. So I recommend leaving that to on. All right, for failure and damage, I recommend turning all of those to enabled for the first three: the crash damage, aircraft stress damage, and engine stress damage, because this will just let you know when you've gone too far with your airplane. Of course, being in a simulator, there's no major consequences if you do cause stress damage or engine stress damage, other than you have to start over. Icing really is not going to have that big of an effect on our training flights. We're not going to be flying in icing conditions, so if you want to turn that off, that's fine. The one thing that I don't know is if this will simulate carburetor ice if it's on, which is a factor in a 152. So we'll talk more about that when we get to the aircraft familiarization and the carburetor heat, and talk about whether you want to have that on or off, or I guess it's visual only is the only other option you're allowed there. Alright, for the navigation aids, I do recommend turning route waypoints, taxi rhythms, and landing paths off. SmartCam I just set to manual. I'm not an expert on how SmartCam works, so I've just got it set to manual, and I don't really use it, and we probably won't be using it that much for training. The point of interest markers, city markers, airport markers, and fauna markers are fun when you're out exploring the world, but when you're in a training environment, they're just going to be kind of cluttering up the visuals and distracting. So we will turn those off, and we also want to learn how to navigate just using normal navigational techniques and without using cheater markers that Flight Simulator can put out there for you. So we will turn all of those off. For the notifications, I recommend turning all of those off too. They just tend to create pop-ups that are distracting and kind of annoying. So I recommend turning those off for the training. User experience, there is not a setting in here that is going to be super important to training. So this is all kind of personal preference. I do have all of it turned off as my personal preference. The only thing I would say is with the ATC voices, do turn those off. We won't really be focusing on radio work, at least initially, and so I would turn those off for now, especially if we go out of towered airports, but which we probably will do a time or two. The air traffic control tower just tends to talk at you insistently after you take off and can be a distraction, and right now I just want to focus on the flying. Alright, so now we'll exit out of the assistance menu back to the options main menu, and let's talk a little bit about controls. Before we talk about setting up controls, let's talk about the controls we're going to be using. I highly recommend the use of a joystick over using a gamepad or keyboard or mouse for control. Even versus a gamepad, a joystick is going to give you much more precision control of pitch and roll and throttle if you have one that has a throttle. So it's going to lead to a lot more enjoyable flying experience and learning experience. If you can find one, preferably one that has an access for yaw and a throttle control. A lot of sticks out there that have the yaw control access do it with a twist on the joystick. So in addition to going forward, backward, left, and right, you can also twist the joystick left and right for a yaw control. And a lot of them out there do have throttle control now. Another thing I'd recommend, if you can find it, is a joystick with a point of view or a hat switch, which is the switch on the top that rotates in 4 directions. That's good for setting up so that you can use that to look around the cockpit or external views, and it works out pretty well in this simulator, particularly since it's all 3D panels. I know that there's been kind of a little bit of a run on joystick hardware right now, and there's a little bit of price gouging going on out there right now because of the demand. But you can still, if you look hard enough, you can find units at a reasonable price point with pretty decent features. And I imagine that's going to even out over the next couple of months as the demand situation works itself out. A lot of flight simmers prefer a HOTAS joystick or controller, which stands for hands on throttle and stick. And what that means is that it just has a lot of buttons either on the stick or the throttle or close at hand, so that when you're flying, particularly in critical phases of flight like approach and landing, you don't have to take your hands off the throttle and stick to manipulate the controls like flaps, autopilot on and off, auto throttles on and off, things like that. You can keep your hands on the stick and focus on the approach, the landing, the takeoff, whatever maneuvers you happen to be doing. If you do have a gamepad, don't get rid of it. It can be used very effectively for a drone camera controller. And if you set that up, it can work out quite well for you. Alright, so this is the menu for changing control configurations. There are quite a few videos out there that go into a lot more depth about the nuances of this process, but we're going to just hit the basics here. There are a number of commands that should be mapped for flight training, so we'll take a look at how to make sure they're assigned or change them if you want to. Up at the top are all of the input devices that are detected. You can scroll left and right to see more devices if they're connected to your system. Each device is initially set to a default profile with default commands that Flight Simulator assigns it. Some are pretty logical, like the vertical axis of a joystick controlling the elevator, but some are less than ideal. On the left-hand side of the screen are options for finding control assignments by searching by name. Searching by input, you just click on the box and then just press the control key, and it will tell you what's assigned to that key. Or you can also search from a list of possible inputs available from that particular control device. It also has a filter that lets you see all assignable commands, those that Flight Simulator deems essential, and those that are currently assigned to this particular input device. Control assignments are on the center screen, and they can be expanded or collapsed individually or by using the Expand Collapse All menu at the bottom left. When displaying assignments, it will only display assignments made to the input device selected at the top of the screen. Control assignments can be duplicated across multiple devices. In other words, you can have the Increase Flaps command assigned to a button on your joystick and a key on your keyboard, and they'll both work. In order to create custom control inputs, you'll need to create a new profile for your selected device, which you do by clicking on Preset Manager. You can create multiple profiles for each device and use them independently. In other words, you can create a personal profile for your joystick, but you can stick with the default profile for your keyboard. You can't create a single profile for all your devices. If you click on New, you'll create a blank profile in which you have to create all the control assignments. It will be completely blank and nothing will be assigned, and you have to assign everything, including elevator and aileron control. If you click on duplicate, you'll create a copy of, in this case, the duplicate profile, since the current profile selected is the T Flight HOTAS X default, which is my joystick's default profile. This is going to pre-map things like elevator control for you, but you'll have to reassign control assignments that you don't like. This can create a situation where you have two commands for a single key, and you'll have to delete the function that you don't want. Let's go ahead and walk through that. Okay, so I'll click on duplicate. It'll ask to name the profile, and I'll just name it T-Flight HOTAS X because that's the name of the controller. I'll call it Alpha Hotel Training, and click OK. And then I'm going to map something. I'm going to map elevator trim down. So I'll type in elevator trim down. And that tells me that it's currently assigned to joystick slider X. That's not what I want. I actually want to assign it to button number 4, which is on the back of the top of the joystick. So I will go in here. I'll do clear current input. And then I will go in here and I will press button number 4. And I'll say I can assign that to you, but it's also going to actuate your brakes. I'll go ahead and accept that, but I'm going to have to go in and clear. So I accept that by validating this. By the way, if you work in windowed mode, at least initially with the initial installation of Flight Simulator, these didn't work well, and you had to go into full screen mode for everything to work well. So if you're having troubles with that, if they haven't fixed that, go into full screen mode. That might fix that. But if I hit validate, that will assign button number 4 to the elevator trim. But the problem is now that's assigned to both the elevator trim and the brakes. So anytime I actuate the elevator trim, I'm also going to actuate the brakes. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to search by input name. I'll push button number 4 and it says, yep, indeed, it's assigned to your brakes and your elevator trim. So I can go in here, click that number 4, which was brakes, and then I can clear that input. And then now, well, it didn't do it. Let's see, clear input, validate. And now it tells me the only thing that is assigned to elevator trim nose down is button number 4, and that's the only thing that button number 4 is assigned to because I'm searching by input right now. Now let's talk about the controls that you want to assign for flight training. I'm going to list these controls exactly as they're listed in Flight Simulator, so they'll be easy to search for and easy to assign. First, and obviously, you need to assign your primary aircraft controls if they're not already assigned by Flight Simulator the way you want them to be. This includes elevator axis or pitch control, up and down, aileron axis or roll control, rudder axis or yaw control, and your throttle axis. Moving on to secondary aircraft controls, probably the two most important controls to assign aside from your primary flight controls are elevator trim down, nose down, and elevator trim up, nose up. Learning how to trim your aircraft and use the elevator trim early on in training will greatly reduce your workload as you move through the training. You also want to set increase flaps, which lowers your flaps in increments, and decrease flaps, which raises your flaps in increments. You also want to set brakes, which actuates your primary wheel brakes. I prefer to set this to the trigger on the joystick. And it's also good to set a control for toggle parking brakes, which turns your parking brakes on and off. So you don't sit on the runway with your parking brakes looking for your parking brake control for 5 minutes when you boot up the Flight Simulator for the first time, like I did. A set of controls that are particular to Flight Simulator are the view commands. The ones we're going to want to set for training include cockpit look left, which pans your camera to the left, cockpit look right, which pans your camera to the right, cockpit look up, which pans up, and cockpit look down, which pans down. These are recommended to be set to a hat switch if you have one. If you don't, you can always use keyboard arrows. Other commands that are handy to have are cockpit quick view left, which kind of snaps the camera 90 degrees left or looks over your left wing or under your left wing. Cockpit quick view right, which does the same thing but with a right wing. And cockpit quick view rear, which looks 180 degrees behind you out your aft window. Other view commands that are good to assign include decrease cockpit view height and increase cockpit view height, which basically move your camera up and down inside the cockpit. This is basically the equivalent of being able to raise and lower your seat. Translate cockpit view left and translate cockpit view right, which basically slides your camera left and right inside the cockpit. This is the equivalent of sliding left and right inside the cockpit. Translate cockpit view forward and translate cockpit view backwards, which are moving the camera forward and backward in the cockpit, basically the equivalent of scooting your seat up or scooting your seat back. Another set of controls that's unique to Flight Simulator is the slew commands or slew controls. Slewing is basically a way to move your airplane and position your airplane in Flight Simulator without having to fly it. You can move the airplane forward, backwards, left, right, up, and down with the slew commands without having to fly the aircraft into a certain position. You can also duplicate these control assignments with flight controls. You can assign them to your joystick, and you can either be in slew mode or fly mode. You can't be in both simultaneously, so those commands can be duplicated. Slew commands that you're going to want to assign are slew translate forward, which moves your aircraft forward. Slew translate backwards, which moves it backwards. Slew translate left, which slides your airplane to the left. Slew translate right, which slides your airplane to the right. Slew yaw left, which moves your nose left. And slew yaw right, which moves your nose to the right. The final set of slew controls you'll want to assign are slew translate down fast and slew translate down slow, which decreases your altitude both at a fast pace and a slow pace, and slew translate up fast and slow, which increases your altitude at both a slow and a fast pace. And the final set of controls we'll talk about is drone commands. These aren't things that you necessarily have to set up for training, but it does make it easier if you do have a gamepad to set up the gamepad so that it can control the drone. It's a good way to explore an area and get good shots of your aircraft and the flying is by using the drone. First one you want to set up is drone X translation axis. I recommend assigning this if you have a 2-joystick gamepad, assigning this to the left joystick horizontal axis. And what this does is move the drone, slide it basically left and right. The drone Z translation axis, I recommend assigning it to the left joystick on your gamepad on its vertical axis, the up and down, and this moves the drone forwards and backwards. The drone Y translation axis, again if you have a 2-joystick gamepad, assign this to the right joystick vertical axis, and this is going to move your drone up and down. And then the drone yaw axis, I recommend assigning to the right joystick horizontal axis, and it moves the drone's nose or yaws it left and right. And the final drone command or controls that you'll want to assign are going to be decrease drone translation speed, which decreases the speed at which the drone moves. Increase drone translation speed, which between the two of these, hopefully you can find a drone speed that you're happy with. Increase drone zoom to basically zoom the camera in, and decrease drone zoom, which zooms the camera out. Toggle drone follow mode, which basically toggles whether or not the drone is flying to follow the aircraft or not. And toggle drone lock mode, which basically toggles whether or not the camera is locked on or tracking the aircraft. Alright, so that should have your simulator set up for flight training. The next time we will take a look at the 152 and get familiar with our aircraft. We'll see you soon.